once again for coming. Today we're going to start out with a presentation by Jack Shay, who's on my right. And he is a local author, and he knew Harvey Roehl. Obviously, all of you know Harvey Roehl. And so I'm not going to take any more of Jack's time. I'll hand it over to him. And thank you, Jack, for doing this presentation. We appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I didn't know that all of you knew Harvey Roehl. I figured some of you did, but am I correct? All of you did know Harvey Roehl? And you loved him? Okay. It's good that you did, because I think you're the ones who are probably going to remember him. He's been gone now for nearly a quarter of a century. He'd be 99 if he were alive today. I knew him from the 1950s. He was a neighbor. I knew him then as a teacher and a dean at a college, which I went to. And I had to interview him a number of times. I was probably one of, I would say, a dozen local journalists or writers who had to interview him. And I knew him in retirement also. His retirement, when he was getting rid of most of the mechanical music pieces that he had and shutting down the Vestal Press, he actually sold it to other people. So I knew him from the start all the way to the end of the Vestal Press. Went to his house several times, saw his mechanical music collection a number of times. He talked with me a number of times also. He would call me if he wanted another copy of a story that was written about him, or if he wanted a second copy of a piece on Ed Link, a local inventor that he was very proud to be associated with as well. And we would talk about everyday things too along the way. So I'll give you a little background about Harvey Roehl. I'm going to talk about him as not so much a pioneer in the field of mechanical music and an expert in the field, but more about the personality that he was in his private life. And some of it may sound a little austere because I don't know if you knew him well enough to notice that he seldom smiled. He was a very stern, sober individual. His milieu was mechanical music. He was very fluent in that, very good in that, and very willing to help people in that. But in the social world, he was a bit of a standoffish person. He never really felt comfortable in social settings. So the outside world knew him, of course, as an educator, first a teacher, then a college dean, a collector of mechanical music machines, an author and authority on mechanical music, publisher of mechanical music books and recordings, a world traveler, often in pursuit of mechanical music instruments, a showman who converted a pickup truck into a crude bandwagon from which he gave calliope concerts, and I'll tell you a little bit more of that later. When he would give concerts, usually it was in parades, and the calliope that he attached to the back of the Ford pickup had an awning over the top of it. It was red and white, striped, and he would wear a getup that was red and white too. He had a straw hat boater that he would wear, and he had a coat that was red and white as well, and he looked like a candy man. And frequently people who didn't know who he was, and honestly, he was not well known in this area. He was not known as the collector of mechanical music. Occasionally stories would come out about him, but generally he was known more to people like you around the country and the world who viewed him as an expert than by locals who knew that he was a famous person. He was also a curator who opened his museum of mechanical machines to those he knew. I went there several times and got free exhibits, and he also had an affiliation with the college that he was dean of in the continuing education program, and he would give continuing education programs for a minimal amount of money of his home.
What college was that?
I'm sorry?
What college?
Which college? Well, originally when he started, it was called Broome Technical Community College. That was back in the late 40s. Then it became Broome Community College. Now it's known as SUNY Broome. He retired in 1973. He was a Republican, a staunch Republican. I have no idea how he would view the current state of politics in our country. I think he would be aghast at what has happened. But a staunch Republican, the old-fashioned Republican conservative values. He was a Kiwanian, and he was a writer, and he was a very good writer. He wrote a piece one time for a local publication on taking a long Amtrak train trip across the country. And he gave it a very favorable review of all the things that he saw and the travel by train. He was fascinated by anything mechanical, anything that had gears or bolts or screws. He felt in his own element at that time. And a better writer than most people would think. If you have some of his catalogs through the years and read the little blurbs, and occasionally he would write a newsletter, and he would write about various things too, you could see that he had a gift for words, a very erudite man. A handful of people knew him as a somewhat off-putting, iconoclastic person, and I knew that too. He had a habit of coming up to you, and he would not say, "Hi, Jack, how are you doing today?" or "I wanted to ask you this." He would just start a conversation. And when he was satisfied with what he came over to say or to ask, he would simply walk away, turn his back. You might be in the middle of answering something. It didn't matter. He would simply put his hands in his back pockets, and he would turn and walk away. And at that point, you knew that the conversation was over. The first couple times it happened to me, I thought, oh, this is a real odd duck. But as I got to know him more, and other neighbors said the same thing about him, I realized that that's just the kind of person he was. He didn't mean offense by it, but it was simply the way that he conducted himself. Again, he was a little bit shy in social conversations. He didn't feel up to it. Talking about mechanical music, of course, was a different thing entirely. I never saw him wear a tie. He wore bow ties. Now, I'm sure when he was in the military, and he was a major in the Air Force Reserve, I'm sure he had to wear conventional ties, and I'm sure he was able to tie them himself. But in his later years, bow ties all the time. And that was his signature look, the bow tie. Paul Simon, the late senator from Illinois, was famous for wearing bow ties, and Harvey Roehl was the other one. When he was at home, he did not look at all like the mechanical music expert that he was. He wore very comfortable apparel, overalls, or maybe khaki work pants, with suspenders, always with suspenders. And he had some kind of hat. It might be a floppy hat, it might be a wide-brimmed hat, it could be one of those modified sombreros that come out quite a ways and have little tentacles at the end to keep the mosquitoes and the flies away. So you seldom saw the top of his head when he was outdoors. And had a habit of having his hands, both hands, thrust into his back pockets. And he'd be looking down all the time, like this. When he was talking with you, occasionally he'd look off, maybe directly at you once or twice. And if he smiled, and I can remember seeing him smile, a full-bodied smile once in my life, he turned around and, as if almost to correct the emotion that he showed with that smile, he turned sober again, like he was trying to erase the little bit of humanity that he allowed to show through. He had emotions, but he just felt very, very uncomfortable, I think, in showing them. I'm not the only one to say this to. All the neighbors felt the same way about him. People who knew him said the same thing as well. He did have a sense of humor. The people at the college that he worked at, and he became administrative dean eventually, they said he had a very wry sense of humor. I would go beyond the word wry, and I'd say it was sardonic, it was sarcastic, and it was very cutting and very biting, but it could be funny. He didn't do it maliciously to hurt people. It was just his way of expressing some mark of disapproval with what he was seeing around him. He was not a gourmet by any means. His wife, by the way, Marion, whom he married early in life, was the complete antithesis of him. She was very friendly. She smiled all the time. She would talk with you, call you by name. She would, when having a conversation with you, let you know that she was leaving. When she started a conversation, it was normal. She would take daily walks around the neighborhood in her retirement years, and she devoted the rest of her career really to supporting her husband. But in her retirement years, when Harvey was divesting himself of the press that he founded, she would take walks with neighbors around the neighborhood. He never did. He never did. You seldom saw him outdoors. He was more or less an indoor person, always tinkering with his mechanical music operations or writing. And I remember a couple times when she said, and she was a New Englander, she was born in Rhode Island, and she would say, well, I've got to fix Harvey some chow now. Tonight we're having hot dogs and beans. I heard that a few times from her. So obviously they were not surf and turf type people. He was very polite in what he said. He never used a swear word that I heard, and other people whom I spoke with said the same thing. I'm one of about a dozen people who wrote about him, but the other people may have passed on or have moved on to other areas, so I suspect that's why Jim asked me to do this, because I'm still here. And I also knew him since 1955 until his death in 2000. So I got to know him in various strata of the world around us and in various capacities. He was very clean and mild in the words that he would use. He could be biting in his sarcasm and his humor, but generally speaking, he was a very polite individual. He wrote limericks in addition to other things, and I always found that to be a little bit odd, because he clearly could have been probably a historian, certainly of mechanical music, and essentially he was. He could have been a travel writer, because he did extensive writing, R-I-D-I-N-G, around the country and the world. And he could have written essays, certainly, compendiums of mechanical music information. But he chose limericks. And he told me one time that he was fairly good at writing limericks, and he wasn't being immodest, he really was good. But his limericks were always based on local things. So he might be writing about a band organ that was here, which people 100 miles away would not have any idea of. So his limericks were of interest to people living in the area, more so than people who would just like limericks. And he told me that the problem in writing limericks was to keep them clean. And I knew exactly what he meant, because the limerick is famous for opening lines that begin with something like, "There once was a young girl from Corfu," and he didn't want to go in that direction at all. So he had a problem with limericks, but his limericks were very erudite, very clean, and very noticeable. He attended my father's wake, and this is typical of Harvey. Marion was very somber, and she said the right things that usually people will say to you to offer condolences at a wake, but Harvey said nothing. And that was typical of him, so I had to take over, and I had to actually thank him for showing up and appreciate him for his friendship with my father over the years. And I think he probably was pleased that I did that, because otherwise he would have shuffled as his usual behavior and probably said something under his breath and just wanted to get away from there. Very uncomfortable in social settings. He appeared lacking in the social graces frequently, and today, people who did not know his private life, and his private life, of course, is the mechanical music, which all of you are familiar with, they probably would say that, well, he's a bit of a geek or a nerd, a very unusual individual. He was a member of the Kiwanis Club, major in the Air Force Reserve, and he was born, and I'll give you this background on him, since some of you may or may not know all these. He was born May 15th, 1924 in Ithaca. Some of you may know where that is. It's the home of Cornell College, Cornell University and Ithaca College in the Finger Lakes region. He served in the Air Force in 1943 to 46, and he was a radar mechanic servicing B-29s in the Pacific Theater of Operations during World War II. Didn't see combat. Returning home, he remained in the Air Force Reserve for another 20 years, and while at college, he married his later wife. She gave up a teaching career of her own to essentially support him, and decided to move with him naturally to Vestal when he took the position at then Broome Technical Community College. And he advanced through the ranks. He was also a state licensed professional engineer and a certified single engine pilot. This man was afraid of heights, by the way. Why he was in the Air Force, why he flew a plane, I don't know. He was afraid of heights. He was terrified of getting up on ladders. And in all the years that I knew him as a neighbor, I never once saw him mowing lawn, either with a push mower or a rider or using a snowblower. His wife did it. So he either had her well trained, or she realized that he needed as much time as possible doing what was important to him, and she didn't mind doing the work that ordinarily a man would do. And when you saw him, he was dressed as an outdoorsman. You thought, well, this guy obviously is a handyman, does a lot of work outside. Never. He rose through the ranks at the college, leaving teaching, and became director of the college's extension division. That would be something like a continuing education program. He was a registrar, associate dean for student records and academic scheduling, and finally the administrative dean, a position he held until 1973. To most people who didn't know him in his official capacities, he would appear to be kind of standoffish and even humorless, and it was because of the way he held himself physically and the way he spoke when he was talking with you. But his office staff, and I knew his staff quite well, and they always said he was very witty and he had a fondness for joking around. So I have to believe that he showed a little bit more of the limerick side of himself when he was at the college than he did with people who knew him on the outside. Music, though, rejuvenated him, and he was very fond of that. He told me once, when I was 10 years old, I saw a player piano. I thought it was the greatest thing I ever heard. And after military school, I bought an old player piano. Then in 1954, I got interested in everything musical. At that time, he began turning his home, and I lived directly opposite him. He began turning his home into a museum. He had to add an addition, and the neighbors, of course, had to sign approvals for him to do that. And the addition doubled the cubic yardage of his house. He added 3 rooms so he could accommodate what grew to be 25 major mechanical music pieces, as large as a piano or larger, and a number of other smaller pieces, similar to what you have here. And he told me that we have, meaning he and his wife, we have almost a comprehensive cross-section of various types of music machines, most of them built over the years in a big industry, which rose and fell during the period between 1900 and 1925. The golden years: music boxes, player pianos, band organs, which are particularly recognizable as merry-go-round organs, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Photo players, which were used in synchronization with movies and provided more sound effects than conventional pianos. And one of the most noticeable pieces that he has, and some of you who have been to his house undoubtedly would have seen this, was a photo player. It was manufactured by the Robert Morton Company in Van Nuys, California. It measured 15 feet by 5 feet and was capable of producing sound with bells, both door and sleigh, chimes, cymbals, drums, both snare and bass, gongs, pipes, both bass and flute, tom-toms, train whistles, bird whistles, and devices to imitate the sound of pistol shots, trolley blasts, and wind. And he told me, quote, "These things were the highest form of movie theater pianos in their day. They were used in movie houses when the manager wanted something more than just a piano but couldn't afford organ." It was the tip of an iceberg in his collection that included grand pianos and orchestrions, which are small automatic orchestras, musical bird boxes in cages, a quinola, a little piece incorporating cymbals, drums, a triangle, and a xylophone, a J.P. Seberg piano, Corporation Arabian Nights art glass with curtains and minarets, a Marquette Piano Company Cremona flute piano of the early 1920s, a 1925 Violano Virtuoso made by Chicago Mills Novelty Company. And he said, "You'd find these things in Greek restaurants and candy kitchens a while ago, and they were made up by a company that also made gambling machines." A coin-operated Rudolf Wurlitzer harp of 1905 vintage, and a Wurlitzer-style 146-band organ. He said this was built in the spring of 1936, and it was used for the old Enjoy Park Carousel in Endicott. Now, for those of you not familiar with the area, the old Enjoy Park Carousel has been moved here because Enjoy Park has been disassembled since then, and the remains of that have been moved here. So what you're looking at now was what he referred to being placed in that Enjoy Park Carousel in Endicott. The most eye-catching piece that he had in his collection, according to most people, was a 1904 57-key Gavioli Fairground organ which he obtained in 1968 in a trade for an automatic pipe organ. He featured his picture in his promotions, stories about his collection, and as cover art on some of his annual publications. It was a pastiche of several independent musical instruments assembled within a sculpted wooden framework decorated by pastoral and still life painted panels, towered 10 feet tall, and displayed a half-size figure of a European band leader in dead center. It was things like this that necessitated building the addition to his house, because his house was a conventional ranch-style house built in the late 40s, early 50s, then in vogue, and he had no idea when he moved there that he would be getting into this as a full-time hobby. So he needed a museum, and building an addition to the house was the easiest way to do that. In 1961, when he was still in his 30s and still employed by the college, still in the Air Force Reserve, he branched into publishing. He wrote a book, and I'm sure a lot of you probably have this book or are familiar with it, called Player Piano Treasury. He couldn't sell it to anyone. No one wanted to publish it. They thought its interest would be slight. So he published it himself and formed the Vestal Press, named in honor of the village in which he was living. He founded the Vestal Press with that book. It sold more than 10,000 copies through the years. He also enlarged the business, publishing other authors' related works on mechanical music and later music in general. In fewer than 20 years, and he started this about 1961, his catalog grew to 68 pages, including insert supplements, and featured more than 700 items dealing with music, amusement rides, antique automobiles, bicycles and railroads, timepieces and clocks and radios. He dealt in books, recorded music, records, 8 tracks, cassette tapes, and piano rolls especially. Sheet music, original and reproduction signs and posters, bumper stickers, old postcards, piano benches, and most impressive actual player pianos. And he told me, we seem to be kind of the headquarters of mechanical music in the country. He also published a newsletter, which is very well written, whenever time permitted, called the Vestal Press House Organ, jammed with stories, photographs, related mechanical music events, something like what's going on here. If he were alive today, he would be, of course, publicizing this very heavily. And he'd be talking to you. I wouldn't be here. I'd just be in the audience. Hobbyist musings, convention summaries, late-minute editions that couldn't make the annual catalogs, and a lot of editorializing. The business grew to such lengths that he was forced to rent 2,000 square feet of space in a warehouse about a half mile from where he lived. And that's where the business really flourished. He had about 6 employees at one time, including his wife and himself. But his mantra in life was, and this is the quote that he gave me, the pleasurable use of leisure time. The pleasurable use of leisure time. That was what he was interested in. And you wouldn't know it by looking at him, because when he was playing his mechanical music devices for anyone, audiences, whether they paid or were there gratis, you wouldn't see him doing this. He wouldn't be tapping his toe. He wouldn't be bouncing along. He was just standing there and absorbing it, but obviously it was something that really intrigued him. He just didn't show it demonstrably. He needed help, so he hired the people when he got the warehouse. And one person that he hired was a person named Gil Williams, who had his own publishing house in the area. Gil Williams was a poet, he was a writer, he was an art collector. He had a lot in common with Harvey Roehl. They both knew each other. And Gil Williams had a knack for, having worked in the book business, having had his own publishing house as well. He knew how to promote books. So Harvey Roehl, when he hired Gil, said, I'm making $250,000 in gross income now. I would like to double that. And of course, Gil Williams was able to do that for him. In a couple years' time, he went from $250,000 gross to $500,000 gross. A couple years later to $750,000 gross. And Gil Williams was able to talk him into going to conventions, book conventions, meeting other book publishers in niche fields. and meeting celebrities and touting more of the titles that he had than his catalog ever could. Gil told me in the first year I was there, he had more book reviews than he had ever had. He had shows in Michigan and Wisconsin. I got him into press shows in New York. If we had a book on totem pole sculpture, I made sure he got in touch with all the lumber people. We'd send out maybe 18 copies and maybe get 15 reviews in lumberjack magazines, which is a phenomenal return rate. We did this rather than send out a random 100 copies. Gil told me, he told Harvey, you know, Harvey, we can expand your line. I want to see an Americana section in your catalog, architecture, picture postcard books, stars of the silent screen, even John Wayne stuff. So even with previously published books, you can do the first American edition. So I would scout a lot of those books for him, things before 1950, and I said to him, you've got to make that catalog more interesting. You can't just rehash the same old items year after year. He had a coterie audience, and they were aging with him. And I told him, you've got to go and meet the world, not operate out of Vestal as though that's the world. He had parochial ideas and just wasn't visible enough. He came to attend big fairs where you'd meet all types of authors. He got involved with American Booksellers Association in Washington, D.C. He learned a lot about the remainder business. We took a couple trips in the big motor coach across the country. Some of you who have been to his house may have seen his motor coach. He called it the Roehl Road Car. It was about 50 feet long, high, and he would take off in that because he could, of course, buy a mechanical music piece and put it in that and bring it back home. So in the last 20, 25 years of his life, that was his vehicle of choice when moving around the country. Gil Williams told me Harvey was quite dumbfounded by going to Madison Square Garden shows, where you might come across alternative presses, and his was considered an alternative press, or a niche press. But he came to realize that he was one of those presses as well. Random House wasn't going to touch his stuff, but a small press is a birthing ground for a lot of new authors and good authors. He didn't have ISBNs, the International Standard Book Numbers, at first, but he got them later. His membership list got bigger and bigger. He had all of his customers coded. There might be a code for aviation and one for cinema. Some customers might have one code, others might have 30, based on what they were interested in. He developed an intensely loyal audience because of his codes. He knew that I knew how to make money. When I left him around 1987, his sales shot beyond the $750,000 range, which was phenomenal for a small press, founded on essentially one book that he couldn't get published anywhere else. The more money we made, the more trips he could take for acquisitions, and he really loved publishing. Along with mechanical music, publishing might have been the big love of his life. He enjoyed it, and probably would have done well as an editor and publisher in a big house somewhere. Through the years, Harvey Roehl became an authority in his field and a prominent lecturer. In the 70s and 80s, he undertook long treasure hunting trips throughout the country in his Roehl Road Car. And he told me, I can't imagine having a better situation in life, making a living based on your hobbies. It's not always easy to do, and we've had to work hard, but when it works, I can't think of a happier situation in life. So even though he was very reluctant to show emotions and fondness and affection, he felt it deep inside. One person I spoke with who, in the last 11, 12 years of his life, took a tour of his house, asked him, she said, have you thought of what you do with your collection after you pass on? And she said that he told her, yeah, we think of that often. She said he looked sad when he said that. And sometimes it was hard to tell when Harvey Roehl was sad or when he was ecstatic, because the emotions were always suppressed, and the look that he showed you was pretty much the same. But of course, someone who valued music the way he did, and not having children, not having grandchildren to pass the collection on to, of course, in his 60s and his 70s would have thought about, what do I do with this? Who's going to get this? Certainly it should go to someone who appreciates it and can carry on what I've done with it. He sold the Vestal Press in 1988 when he was in his mid-60s. He kept a minority ownership share in the business at first, and he simply concentrated on his museum collection and ongoing tours of his house, lecturing, travel, and local appearances dressed in his Candyman outfit of red and white striped paraphernalia. But eventually the Vestal Press went the way of all earthly endeavors. It got acquired by another press, it changed names, another merger took place, and the Vestal Press no longer exists today. The titles are probably, some of them, still in print and available somewhere, certainly on the internet. Gradually, he began dismantling his prized collection as well, his livelihood. Through most of the 1990s, Parkinson's disease interfered with simple household functions, and then he was stricken with pancreatic cancer. He died at home on June 21st, 2000. He was 76. His wife survived him by 4 years. She died in 2004. And I spoke at length after her passing, with their next-door neighbors, Martha and Walter Courtney, who have since passed away as well. And they probably were the closest people to him on a non-professional level throughout his many decades living in Vestal. And Martha said, I remember when we moved here, at night we heard music, and that of course was the mechanical music devices. And I thought, what have we got ourselves into? But Mary and his wife was very considerate. The rooms were well insulated. We really didn't hear him playing their mechanical music pieces. She was always very conscious of noise. And I'm sure that's true. I lived across the street from him. I heard the music. I remember hearing that, but I enjoyed it because it was wonderful music. And it had a beat, it had a melody, unlike most of the music that we have today. And you're hearing it played on instruments which are suited to play that kind of music. So whenever he would play it, and it was not at 10 o'clock at night. It might be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 5 o'clock at night, for maybe an hour or so. He was either giving a tour, a private tour, or maybe testing it out. It was wonderful hearing that. I remember cutting the lawn and listening to this. I thought, well, this sure beats listening to the buzz of the lawnmower. Very melodic. The music room that they built was over their garage. This addition that they put on was over their garage, and it extended backward. It was a huge room lined with shuttered cabinets for piano rolls, loaded with piano rolls. There were always at least 2 and sometimes 3 pianos there, a baby grand, a full grand, and uprights. He would refurbish the uprights and then sell or trade them. I had a player piano too. It was actually my mom's, and I remember him coming over in the late 50s and early 60s, and he expressed an interest in it. And my mom was reluctant to sell it or trade it to him because she had learned how to play the piano on that, and we had player piano rolls as well. But I remember he took a vested interest in it, and that might have been why he was a little closer to me. I think he might have identified with the player piano that I had in the house. Another thing that one of the neighbors said, this is the man, he said he, meaning Harvey, was kind of clumsy. Once Marion was teaching him how to make a TV dinner. It was though you would need directions on how to make a TV dinner. And this is a man who knew how to read and interpret manuals. He could write manuals on mechanical music. He was like Albert Einstein in a way. You know, he had this erudite sense, this top-heavy sense of very unusual information and how to collate it and use it, but yet he might have trouble in matching socks. And Marion was teaching him how to make a TV dinner, and he turned the oven on self-clean, 800 or 900 degrees. He incinerated the TV dinner. He got a bunch of ash out of it. Another time he was driving his Calliope truck. This is the Ford pickup that he put the Calliope on, and it had an awning overhead. So the awning would have been higher than the cab of the truck. And he drove into the drive-up window at a bank. You can guess what happened. He drove up and he took the top off by hitting the overhang. He snapped the whole top all off. And he told me, meaning not me, but the neighbor, he told me, I may as well tell you before you find out from someone else about it. That's the way he was. He did admit the embarrassing things that he did. He had global positioning system in his vehicle later in life. Didn't do him any good. One time he was going to Syracuse, which is all of 65, 70 miles north of Binghamton. It's a pretty easy drive. If you get on Interstate 81, or you just get off at Syracuse. It's that easy. He still got lost on the way to Syracuse, if you can imagine that. He followed the directions that they gave him, and he still got lost. If he needed a tool, he went out and bought it. He would never use the tools, but he knew that they were needed for various functions around the house. And he bought the best that you could buy. Then he would misplace it, and he'd have to go out and buy another one to take its place. And again, he was afraid of heights and ladders, and this is a pilot. So it's amazing that he was able to fashion a career in the military, in the Air Force, and be a licensed pilot and be afraid of heights, but he was. He was very bright. This is what the next door neighbor told me. He was very bright, but his wife was the wind beneath his wings. And I tend to agree. She was very supportive of him, and the neighbor told me he never would have survived without her, probably from a common sense standpoint. Once, when they were building this addition on the house, and it was over the garage, and it was extending backward, they wanted to have a circular staircase. Some of you who took tours may have gone up the circular staircase in his house. While it was being built, there was a hole that was built to accommodate the circular staircase, to go from the garage floor to the first floor. And his wife fell through that hole. And rather than asking her how she was, when he came across her, he said, "Well, there goes our Europe trip." When he was dying of cancer, and this is what the gentleman neighbor told me, Walter, when he was dying of cancer, he was selling off all his machines so she wouldn't have to. They belonged to the International Music Box Society and to several organizations like that, and they probably did a lot of trading and got rid of many pieces with these places. Many of their assets were given to charitable organizations and churches. The next door neighbor told me, continued, he was out on his back deck in his robes and his wheelchair. This is Harvey. And he was watching this big, huge band organ go. It was being trundled up and going to the person who had bought it. It was his pride and joy. And I said to Harvey, "Harvey, you must be kind of sad to see your pride and joy go." And he said, "I'm glad to see them go to another generation so another generation can enjoy them." He got rid of 90% of his music collection. He knew people all over the world who wanted certain pieces. He didn't want them in a barn to rot. He also sold the Roehl road car before he got seriously sick. The recording music business was his wife's, actually. And I remember traveling to, I think it was called the House of Music in Michigan. And it was a museum, and they had a gift shop, of course, and they had recordings. And I remember seeing cassette tapes. This is back about 30-some years ago. And certainly it was Harvey Roehl's music. And her name was on it. So the Marion Roehl Corporation Incorporated, something like that. And she continued that for a while after Harvey died. And she once said to the neighbor, "You have children, we have pianos." The day before he died, and this is Martha, the next door neighbor, Martha, the day before he died, I read him the paper, the Wall Street Journal, a Republican paper. He wanted me to read the editorials, but he was awful sick that day. That day, on the 20th of June, Marion got a hospital bed for him. Hospice was there. He was incapable of moving himself when I had to help. And Harvey asked me, "How come we can do such and such," meaning very difficult things to do, and the Binghamton Mets, which is our local baseball team, can't win a ball game? And he said that simply because the next door neighbors were sports fans, and he knew that. He himself never liked sports, never had an interest, but he wanted to show a little camaraderie with the next door neighbors, so he mentioned that. And the neighbors told me this. They said it was just his way of identifying with them. And again, this is a man that did not show emotion, but if you knew him, you could see it in statements like this. "He catered to us one last time," he said. "He died during the night, June 21st, 2000. This is a quote from the neighbor. "Marion came over in the morning and had papers in her hand. And the paper said, 'Upon my demise, would you call all these people around the country,' and perhaps some of them are you. This is the morning of the 21st. He was buried from the First Congregational Church, which is in Binghamton. The preacher came out with bright red robes, and he said, "I don't ordinarily wear red robes, but I will for Harvey," because Harvey had always worn a red jacket for church, with a bow tie, of course. And they played "When the Saints Go Marching In," and people were clapping, and the minister played the saxophone. That's the kind of music Harvey liked and wanted. It was a joyous occasion. It was a New Orleans-type funeral. Some of his ashes were scattered in Ithaca, his hometown. Marion scattered them, and there were some left when she passed away, and their ashes were scattered on a beach in Rhode Island, her initial home. And I'll close with a quote from Gil Williams, the person who became his manager for about an 8-year period and really increased the salesmanship of the Vestal Press from about 200,000 to more than 750,000. And he said about Harvey, he loved the art of the tinkerer. He said it was a dying art. He admired inventor Ed Link. Some of you probably either knew him or know of him. He was very driven by work. He was fastidious in his inventory. You have to be quite clever to operate a business. I think his associates and customers were not aware of how much duct tape he had to use to keep everything together, speaking metaphorically, not literally duct tape. I thought someone Harvey's age wouldn't like the computer, and as I think Bill told me earlier today, that he did like the computer. He adapted to it, and he was good at latching onto technology. But then Gil Williams ended by saying, "I don't think he got burned out, but ... So he probably did, and he was in failing health, and that certainly would have taken a toll. Again, not having children or grandchildren, so you're wondering, what do I do with this collection that I have acquired? I don't know what's going to happen to it. I hope it doesn't wind up just in someone's trash. So he would have been concerned about that as well. And one final quote from Gil Williams. His absolute favorite instrument was the photo player, and he could play the piano reasonably well. He loved silent films, Charlie Chaplin, Lillian Gish, theater organ history, and he had the ability to comprehend almost anything he wanted to do. While he was a quiet man who seldom smiled, he was a man of consummate achievement. Harvey was the last of the great tinkerers. If you have any comments or questions, I'll try to field them.
I'll start off with one, not a comment. Harvey was out. You mentioned that he couldn't play the piano particularly well. Well, he was at our house one time, and I played a new roll that I got, Arms in America. And if you haven't heard it, it ends up with like 16 people playing the piano. Really complicated stuff. And I got to the end and I said, and I put it in rewind, and started back. And he said, "Wait a minute," and he stopped it. And he said, I really like this part. And he replayed, having never heard it before. He replayed about 4 or 5 measures with all the complications, just like he played it 100 times. It was unbelievable.
Anyone else?
I have had the pleasure of visiting Harvey and Marion's collection on a number of occasions. The last time that I was there was in 1996. There was an East Coast chapter Music Box Society meeting here in Binghamton, and Tim Wagner and I had made arrangements to go to his place a day before, because we knew that if we just went on the regular tour, we wouldn't be able to hear as many instruments as we wanted for as long as we wanted. So we went in, and this was absolutely great. He said, well, play whatever you want, and if you don't know how this stuff works, it's about time you learn. So he let us loose, and we were there for several hours and just had a great time. But the other thing I want to mention, which really speaks of his sense of humor, when I learned that he was not doing well and his time was pretty limited, a few weeks before he died, I called, and Marion answered, and I told her Dan Wilkie, and I wonder if I could speak with Harvey, and she said, well, yeah, but just for a little while, not too long. And so I called essentially to say goodbye, and we chatted for a little bit, and I said at the end of the conversation a quote from a now deceased pastor of one of the church that I went to, and coincidentally I told this to John Raver just yesterday. I said, well, Harvey, if we don't meet again, if I don't see you again, I'll see you up there. And he said, well, you should. After all, we contribute to our local public television station.
That gets in heaven.
Anyone else?
Hi, so if I haven't met you, I'm Dave Clark. I live here in Binghamton. I've lived here my whole life. So Jack mentioned that Harvey was the dean of continuing education. Well, my dad worked for him. He taught drafting on nights, 2 nights a week. So he was able to arrange a tour, just my dad and me and my brother. And I was about 8 years old. So that's how I got interested in mechanical music, was that trip. And one of the things I remember is they had a doormat, and the doormat said, people with neat houses are boring. That was the doormat. I always thought that was, typical of Harvey's humor. The other thing that was kind of interesting was on the Mills Violano machine he had, which would play a violin if you had never seen one. There's a little sign he put on it. He says, the owner of this instrument had to pay the handsomely sum of $10 for this instrument. So he got a Mills Violano for $10. Wow. And the last thing I wanted to mention was Jack mentioned the red truck with the red and white awning. Well, I had a calliope which Harvey could play. So we were at a rally, I think it was in Fremont, or it might have been Flint, Michigan, I don't remember. But anyways, there was going to be a parade, and he wanted to play. So he asked me if I would drive the truck. I said, yeah, no problem. So I'm maybe 28 years old, so I get in the truck, and it's a manual shift. It's like, uh-oh, I kind of know how to do this, but I could see me dumping Harvey off the back of that truck as we were going down the parade route. But it all worked out fine, and it was slow, and it was a good time. So really miss Harvey Roehl.
Anyone else with an anecdote or story?
I have one. When we were first looking around for our band organ for the Endicott Rotary Club, one of the things we wanted to do was to buy the band organ that used to play in this carousel when it was located down by the river. And I know Enwell was trying to do the same thing. And so we were trying to figure out, okay, what happened to that? And it didn't take long to find out that when the band organ stopped playing, nobody knew what to do about it, but they knew something about Harvey Roehl. He might have some interest in this thing. They sold it to Harvey for $25. We found it. It's out in where? Illinois? Illinois. And he's not selling it for $25.
Well, it is not.
Anyone else? Anything for Jack? One last comment. I too am a private pilot. I've flown a mile and a half high. You couldn't get me on this roof. So it's nice to know I'm not alone anymore. But Jack, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, I appreciate it. I'm not feeling all that well. I just came back from being out of town, and I went away healthy, and I came back very unhealthy. So my ears are not hearing what they should. My nose is not behaving the way it ordinarily does. My mouth and throat are not behaving to. The brain, I think, is working. I hope you'll be the judges of that. But I just wanted to thank you for being here. And again, someone who knew Harvey Roehl from 1955 to 2000. There are only 3 people in his neighborhood who remember him at all. 3 people. I'm one of the 3. The other 2 did not know him well. And he is pretty much forgotten. I wrote a book on local history some years ago, and I had a chapter on Harvey Roehl. And I gave the preview of that chapter to the then owners of the house from this area. They had never heard of Harvey Roehl. That's how rather anonymous he was in the neighborhood. And he had been retired from the college for 50 years now, from 1973 to 2023. And if you go to the college today and you talk about Harvey Roehl, there's no one there who knows him. They may be familiar with the name. They may say, yes, in our archives, there's a plaque on the wall, and I've seen his name, but he is not remembered in the college at all, which is sad, but it's the way of life. It's the way the world goes. He is remembered by people like you, and that's wonderful. And I applaud you for remembering him, for being here, for sharing your anecdotes about Harvey Roehl. I think he would be very pleased by this. I don't think he would smile, but inwardly he would be beaming. And I would just encourage you to carry on the tradition that you shared with him and pass his legacy on, if you can, to your families and whoever else might have an interest in it. That might be the best way to remember him. Again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jack. We really appreciate it. It's nice to hear some of the other stories about Harvey. Very interesting. I love how you presented. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day and start up the organs.